Hello, everyone, and here we are again back with the traditional 2 weeks break. And today, another episode of ITS Laboratories Pickup Vlog and another guest from faraway Dubai, which is in the United Arab Emirates, Abhishek Chhabra. Abhishek is an engineer, and he's also a market business development manager in Thomas Bell-Wright International Consultants in Dubai. He's been advocating the need for compliance to standards to improve the quality and safety across various industry for the last several decades. And he's been working on several development initiatives for codes and standards, specifically together with the Bureau of Indian Standards, ASTM, United Arab Emirates Fire and Safety Code of Practice, Saudi Standards, Metrology and Quality Organization. Abhishek, actually a regular speaker at Façade and Fire Safety conferences, workshops organized by Society of Fire Protection Engineers, insurance industries, and he's very often invited to be a keynote speaker at various events. He also published a variety of articles in different engineering magazines, and he's quite active in the social media. And it was my pleasure that he accepted my invitation to participate in ITS Laboratories Pickup Vlog. So Abhishek, thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolute pleasure, Anna. It's fantastic. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. I am usually very passionate when it comes to compliance, conformity, and since the last decade or so, I have been heavily involved in fire safety and lots of concepts related to fire safety and conformity. So very happy to be here, remembering the days when I was invited to speak at the Fire NZ conference and had a wonderful trip to New Zealand and met some fantastic people. So when you reached out to me, it was almost like, oh, okay, this is New Zealand. I must touch base and say hi to everybody. So thank you very much for having me here.
Absolutely, a lot of reasons for you to be here with me, right? No doubt. Okay, so Abhishek, I know that Thomas Bell-Wright International Laboratory has witnessed the evolution of testing compliance, specifically for facades, and it's been happening the last 10 years. Could you please elaborate on that and let us know what has changed so far? What are those interesting new updates to the rules and compliance?
Sure. Well, the last 10 years have seen a lot of change. In fact, since we had the Address Hotel tragedy here in the UAE, in December 2015, so it's about 5-6 years. In the last 5-6 years, the rate of change has been phenomenal. But if I were to rewind back 10 years, in 2011, it was a very rough market from a point of view of compliance enforcements. The new annexure to the code, so the code was earlier published in 2000, I think 9 or 11, and the annexure to that code was published specifically for cladding, and it had a bunch of requirements which were related to material tests. So for example, the aluminum composite panels, the cores needed to be tested separately in an exposed condition, as well as large scale fire tests were being asked for. But this was a time where enforcement was not very strict, and we had all levels of compliance and sometimes no compliance at all, where subcontractors could just procure their self-brand aluminum composite panels or materials, and developers and contractors would just go off to another country and procure a few 1,000 square meters for their project with their own brand name. And there was only the British standard, the BS 4764, part 567, and class 1 and class 0 was one of the few compliance requirements that were kind of sold around. The annexure made it very strict, but the implementation was not yet very, very strict on the ground. The Address Hotel fire triggered a lot of change, and it triggered a change in one direction on making the code and the compliance requirements a little more strict in terms of detailing the requirements, as well as the conformity mechanisms evolved very, very well to be very, very strict. To explain to you, on one side, the compliance requirements, because the country is a small country, it did not want to limit to a specific standard, like the British standard or the American standard. So they tried to keep the compliance net in terms of standards allowed a bit wide. So they allowed American, British, European standards to a great extent. But for the reaction to fire tests for materials, by 2017, the government arrived at an understanding that the European norm, which does the classification of A1 or A2 as per the EN 13501-1, and I believe there are equivalents in Australia and New Zealand as well for classification, that these were the basic requirement for ensuring that products like aluminum composite panels or one of several other cladding materials, which could be anywhere from EIFS systems, sandwich panels, and so many other materials, they were all mandated to comply, A, at a material level, the material should qualify, and B, also at least one large-scale fire propagation test as a system test. So it came as a requirement for the manufacturer to come up with at least one mock-up design that proves that their material, along with a given system, functions and operates and does not propagate fire. And the standards that were allowed were not just the American standard, which is the NFPA 285, but also the British standard, the BS 8414, also the FM standard, as well as the ISO standard. So the allowance of choosing the standards was very, very wide. It allowed materials and people who have tested their products across the world. But the second requirement, which is related to how conformity is realized, became very, very evolved, very, very strict, very, very stringent. And that was, first and foremost, the material supplier needs to have what is called a certification and listing, wherein the manufacturer's factory gets audited by a third-party certification body regularly, right from establishing the traceability of the material that is to be tested, and post-test, there is a very rigorous audit to ensure that the material that is getting manufactured in the facility is manufactured in the same way with the same raw materials, same processes, and it often carries a certification mark or a traceability number that can be checked at the construction site. Two, there was a requirement that after the certification and listing, the supplier has to register themselves with the civil defense, whether it is Dubai or Abu Dhabi or any of the states of the country. And this registration provided the commercial linkages, saying, well, you are a supplier, you could be based anywhere in the world, but there has to be someone responsible and liable in case something goes wrong. So they required a local entity to be established, and which defined the commercial linkage, saying you can't just run away from the country. So this sets the material suppliers requirements, very, very stringent, but it doesn't stop there, because the requirements go right up to the contractor, the facade contractor, the facade consultant, and it mandates inspections at 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, and 100% of the installation of the cladding. So there is a independent third-party body or an independent inspection agency or the fire consultant or the fire and facade consultant who takes ownership of doing the inspection, and they have to sign it off along with civil defense. So massive shift in terms of compliance requirements, as well as clearly defining liability and responsibility of stakeholders. And each of these stakeholders kind of get linked with the civil defense. So very, very good mechanism we feel has established now. And a lot of countries are looking towards what the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code has come to be.
It's actually quite impressive. Such a multi-layer compliance system, you know, and the conformity to it. It's just absolutely overwhelming. You guys are setting quite a high level of standards, and everyone should look up at United Arab Emirates system because it's very robust from what I can hear. Very robust.
Yeah, because the accident which happened end of 2015. And it was the year of 2016 where a lot of changes were being brought about on the technical side, and they were out there for review in 2017. So all the industry was reviewing the final changes, saying this is what we will adopt, and that is when the Grenfell tragedy happened in the UK in June. And it triggered some more final iteration saying, wait a minute, we need to tweak this a little further. We need to make sure this is taken care of, this is taken care of. So while the industry had already started to move towards this conformity mechanisms, by 2018, it was being implemented with renewed vigor and energy because the country felt that it was huge awareness happening all over the world as well.
Yeah, and objectively, Emirates is the land of skyscrapers, especially Dubai, right? So it's like kind of obligatory if you have especially some cases of fire to make sure in the future you'll mitigate all the possible risks.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. So I'm quite looking forward to the next question then, to the discussion.
Okay.
So fire code of United Arab Emirates, I'm sure quite robust from what I've heard about facades. And I'm quite curious myself to learn more specifically about passive fire protection and about fire-rated doors compliance. Maybe you can elaborate on that as well.
Sure. Yes. Passive fire protection is given a good weightage here in the code. And fire doors are a very integral part. Again, a lot of evolution in terms of how fire doors have been perceived from an era long ago where people did not quite comprehend how to assess a fire door, to now, as I was explaining, that the new version of the code has become very good and very clear in conformity mechanisms. So while in the very similar flow as I explained for cladding material, the mandatory compliance requirements are certification and listing, which means that the door supplier needs to have a listed set of doors before which they can be a supplier, exactly in the same lines as I was explaining for cladding. And this time around, the code also added a chapter 18, which is a roles and responsibilities chapter. And this chapter defines to a great extent what are the roles, responsibilities, and hence liabilities for everybody, ranging from the architect, the consultant, the fire consultant, the contractor, the subcontractor, the material suppliers, right up to tenants and facility management companies. So there is a very detailed requirement setting, and hence on one side, when the fire doors need to be certified and listed, there is almost a secondary requirement in terms of liability that the subcontractor who is supplying the doors
Mm-hmm.
needs to give proof that for that given project, if there are variations from the listed door, then the supplier needs to provide evidence. Very often, this evidence requires additional testing, and the code calls for traceability fire door labels to be put on all fire doors. And again, have a fairly rigorous inspection mechanism in place to ensure that there is some stakeholder, it could be the fire consultant or the main contractor, who takes the responsibility of inspection, that yes, the doors that are being installed are correct. And there's another change that kind of happened 5-6 years ago here, that that is again very setting the bar high, as we experienced earlier as well, which was again driven by the civil defense. And it was driven on the lines of the fact that in the past, many joineries and fit out companies could almost take the license of a design, which was a tested fire door, mainly wooden fire doors.
Mm-hmm.
And these fire doors, which were originally tested somewhere else by somewhere else, were being manufactured by these entities, which were fit out companies or joineries, and on the basis of certification evidence of someone else. So civil defense kind of put an end to this mechanism and started enforcing in 2015 that each supplier or the entity who is going to supply the fire doors needs to themselves do at least one fire test of their own by themselves to list that primary door or set of doors which they take the primary responsibility of. And hence, it was a massive learning for many companies and many stakeholders. And I cannot forget the look on the face of some of the people who tested their doors, who were so confident that, we are being pushed to do this for no reason. And when the doors have failed in a few minutes, it was massive learning for them to say, oh, and all of this is factoring in the fact that testing fire doors and expecting repeatability of performance in a fire door is a matter of massive debate around the world. But still, if you have a door which is supposed to last 60 minutes or 90 minutes, and the door cannot last 3 minutes, then you have a major disconnect. Something is really wrong.
By your supplier.
So
Obviously.
then, but now, hats off to the civil defense, who have really been very stringent in driving these requirements in the last 5-6 years. So at least when it comes to fire doors, this is being enforced fairly well, as well as similar kind of mandatory requirements for glazing partitions and several other types of fire doors, where the supplier who takes on the responsibility has to test their own doors and get their doors listed.
Right. Just a question, those doors which are listed with the civil defense, so all of them, all the tabs should be necessarily tested, or some of them can be assessed based on the testing. And who is doing the assessments? If
Right. So this is something that continues to be debated here in this part of the world. And that's primarily because civil defense in the UAE comes with a point of view that you need to have primary evidence of testing.
Mm-hmm.
So you would have a door supplier who would test and certify, let us say, 3 doors or 4 doors, okay, or 5 doors sets. And these are 5 different designs. You could have a single, you could have a double of given combination of hardware, because you are talking of a door assembly and not just a door frame and a door leaf separately. And this certification and listing then translates into a civil defense document, which is civil defense recognition. So supplier so-and-so from so-and-so place has these 3 doors or 4 doors listed and recognized with us. And this is where the Chapter 18 of the roles and responsibility triggers a very interesting action. The subcontractor who is buying the doors uses this civil defense approval as the go, no go criteria to select the supplier.
Mm-hmm.
So you select the supplier saying, yes, you are authorized to sell in the country, and then tenders out the requirement of their project, saying, here is the door schedule for my project, and here are, I don't know, 400 door types. And that's where a detailed assessment needs to be done. Very often the subcontractor or the fire consultant will call for additional tests or additional listings, and in very, very rare cases, an engineering evaluation or an engineering judgment, which has to come from the same certification body who has certified the doors and no one else, is used as a means to convince the civil defense or the fire consultant to say, well, these small deviations from the listed doors versus what needs to come on the project should be allowed for.
So basically, laboratory is the source of this assessments and judgment.
And the certification body, the certification body. The certification body is the body which is taking the primary ownership of what is coming out from the factory and what is reaching the construction site.
Right.
And this is where the liability responsibility goes on to the procurer. So the procurer needs to have an inspection in place. The procurer needs to verify the document saying, well, my drawings in my requirements for my projects are so and so. What is the certification evidence? What is the engineering judgment evidence? Is it aligning or not? And if it is not, the repercussion goes on to the procurer. So very, very robust system has been set in place.
Yeah, impressive. Cool. Listen, and the last question, which is one of my favorites. I have like favorite questions, so this is one of them. And it's about mass timber. And probably you've noted this massive trend of increasing the usage and application of mass timber substrate in the construction, specifically here in this part of the world, Australia and New Zealand, of course in Europe, in America. Basically, from what I hear, in the major part of the world, so it's all happening positive for mass timber. So what about Middle East and specifically the Emirates? Are you guys fond of mass timber? Or not
so much, not so much. Even though I must say that we've done some tests. We had some manufacturers who had tested their cladding systems with a mass timber substructure as part of the mock-up. And if I'm not wrong, we have done some tests even for suppliers who supply into New Zealand and Australia, as well as I think it is very common in Europe as well to use mass timber, but not so popular here.
Right. So why do you think? What's the reason? Because it's too hot, or concrete?
I wouldn't know, but primarily it is about building materials, availability of building materials, and also the environment in which the building materials are used. Timber is great. I don't know. I'm not a big expert of timber and mass timber. That's not something we've done a lot here. So I would refrain from, I could logically come up with something saying maybe it becomes too dry or something, but I would not attempt. It's not an area of expertise. So,
well, listen, quite a lot of precious information, honestly speaking, specifically on the way you guys ensure in Emirates that it's all compliant and conforms to the standards and codes. For your time. Thank you for your time, and we keep in touch about that, and have a great day.
Absolutely. Good luck to you and everybody around there in New Zealand. We look forward and hope that the country becomes safer, and that's all our wishes all the time.
Yeah, we are very safe here. We are very safe, COVID-free, and thanks to our government and the illumination strategies. So yeah, cool. Thank you. Thanks.